My name is Sarah Schlesinger. I will be kind of emceeing in between the panels today. I'm the Executive Director of TAG, and I'm so glad that you're here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it directly over to our very first panel, which is a very special discussion on the 1917 Conservation Amendment. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ken Kramer, our moderator for this panel. He is the Water Resources Chair and Legislative Advisor to the Lone Star chapter of the Sierra Club. Let's welcome him.
So thank you, Sarah. I hope that some of you who can't see me can at least hear me from that side of the room. I want to add my thoughts and words to what has been expressed already in terms of the impacts of Hurricane Harvey. I'm sure, as Gary pointed out, that all of us in this room have been touched in some way, directly or indirectly, by the impacts of that hurricane. And it is actually somewhat timely that our first session today is going to focus on an amendment to the Texas Constitution that was adopted 100 years ago. And as you will hear, in part, in response to some major flooding in the state of Texas, plus a number of other water issues. And although the original impact of the Conservation Amendment, as it's called, in 1917, may not have been on groundwater per se, which is the focus of most of you in this room, it definitely has come to encompass and probably was intended to encompass a whole range of natural resources, including water resources and groundwater. So just a couple of bits of background as to how this session came about. Almost a year ago, I was presenting to the University of Texas Environmental Law Society, and after my presentation, one of the environmental law students at UT came up to me, introduced himself, and began a conversation about the Conservation Amendment of 1917 to the Texas Constitution. And he told me that he was writing an article that was going to be submitted to the Texas Water Journal about the Conservation Amendment, and asked me if I knew if there were any plans to sort of recognize and celebrate the 100th anniversary of the passage of that amendment throughout the state of Texas in this year, 2017. And I had not heard of any plans to do so. So from that conversation and communication began an idea that we brought forward to the Texas Association of Groundwater Districts about a session at the Groundwater Summit that would talk about and explore the impacts and the importance of the Conservation Amendment that was enacted by the voters of Texas exactly 100 years ago last week. That environmental law student was Thales Smith, and Thales has prepared a presentation to give you a little bit of background about the origin of the Conservation Amendment and how it came about and what its initial impacts were. So I'm going to turn the podium over to Thales to make that presentation, and the presentation is going to be followed by a panel discussion of four very knowledgeable water experts who I'll introduce to you in a few minutes as we talk about conservation and the importance of the Conservation Amendment today and into the future. So without further ado, let me introduce Thales Smith, who's a second-year law student at University of Texas and the co-president of the UT Environmental Law Society, and he's going to be making the presentation about the 1917 Conservation Amendment. Thales.
Welcome to the Texas Groundwater Summit. I'd like to thank Ken Kramer and Sarah for putting together this panel on the 100th anniversary of the Conservation Amendment. In November 1913, it began to rain. It rained all across the state of Texas, and the Brazos and Colorado rivers left their banks and formed a 60-mile wide lake near the coast. To put this flood in context, I read recently that the flood waters from Hurricane Harvey had risen to their highest point in the last 104 years in LaGrange. And if you go back 104 years, turns out that's 1913 and this flood that happened. And so the picture on the slide is from Waco when this flood happened. And you can see the kind of impact that it had on the city. And certainly further down near the coast, the waters were much more devastating. Just 2 years later, a drought set in that lasted until 1919. And this drought became the drought of record for the state of Texas until the Great Drought in the 1950s. And this picture is of an ROTC student, Emory Hughes, who was going to St. Edward's University at the time. And he and a friend were down in the bed of what is now Lake Austin. And they saw this board laying there, and you can kind of see he's standing on top of it. And they decided to take this photo of him just straddling what was left of the Colorado River. So this drought and the floods that happened before it had devastating impacts on the population and economy of Texas. But policymakers really had no legal mechanism with which to hold back the floods and save water in times of drought. This is because the Texas Constitution at the time especially, was a very limited document. It limited what government could do, and it limited how much debt the state government could take on. In 1904, there was an amendment passed that allowed water districts to accrue a limited amount of debt, but it wasn't nearly enough to deal with the kinds of floods and droughts that Texas was experiencing in the 1910s. Oops. Another method that Texans used to try and finance water projects was to enlist the help of the Army Corps of Engineers, because the Army Corps had funding for navigation projects on rivers throughout the United States. And so the Army Corps did a number of studies along Texas rivers. They rarely found the rivers to warrant navigation projects because the rivers fluctuated too much in width and depth, et cetera. But in a few rare instances, they actually did decide to start building some projects. And so on the slide right now is a picture of some work on the Brazos River constructing locks and dams for boat traffic up the river. Now, as you might notice, the date on this slide is March 1913. All of this work was washed away in the floods later that year. Now, the Texans who pushed for these navigation projects, they didn't really want navigation as much as they wanted the infrastructure. And I have a quote from Walter E. Long, who was the secretary of the Austin Chamber of Commerce in the 1910s. And he said that, quote, "It should be constantly borne in mind that only through the guise of navigation could any river development be expected from the federal government. The U.S. engineers could hold out the only hand to help provide methods of stopping floods. On the part of businessmen and statements to the contrary, no one took navigation too seriously." So this navigation strategy ended up being unsuccessful. And the solution to Texas's water management problems was the Conservation Amendment. The Conservation Amendment set a broad mandate for the state to conserve, preserve, and develop its water and other natural resources. Specifically, the Conservation Amendment provides that the conservation and development of all the natural resources of this state, and the preservation and conservation of all such natural resources of the state are each and all hereby declared public rights and duties, and the legislature shall pass all such laws as may be appropriate thereto. The amendment also allowed the legislature to create districts that could accrue as much debt as the voters in those districts would allow. The amendment also covers groundwater and is the constitutional authority for groundwater conservation districts' regulation and management of groundwater. The idea for the conservation amendment was promoted by groups in river valleys throughout the state. And my research on the conservation amendment has focused on the man who's been called the father of the conservation amendment, State Representative Leonard Tillotson from Sealy in Austin County. Leonard Tillotson was part of a group in the Brazos Valley that eventually ended up creating what is now the Brazos River Authority. Leonard Tillotson is credited as being the primary author of the Conservation Amendment, and he was the author of the committee report on the amendment in the House. In this committee report, Leonard Tillotson explains that the Conservation Amendment, quote, declares the conservation and preservation of all natural resources of the state, public rights and duties, and confers upon the legislature comprehensive authority to enact law adequate to the fulfillment of the purposes contemplated in the amendment. Leonard Tillotson also proposed that the Conservation Amendment be set for a special standalone election for its vote by the people of Texas, its approval vote. And that's why the anniversary of the Conservation Amendment was this past August 21st. The Conservation Amendment easily made it through the legislature. The Senate unanimously approved the amendment, and in the House there are only 4 dissenting votes against the amendment. So this is the front page of the Houston Post from the day that the amendment went up for its approval vote. And as you can see, there was a lot of other things on people's minds at the time. There was World War I, and there was Governor Paul Ferguson's financial scandal that was going on. But up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a little square that says, vote for the amendment. And Texas newspapers were universally in favor of this amendment. The voter turnout on the day of the election was very lackluster. The Austin American reported that, quote, city and county officials commenting on the election declared that the vote was the smallest ever polled. Nevertheless, the amendment passed on a roughly 60-40 margin. And the actual creation of districts was delayed by World War I, but eventually in 1929, what is now called the Brazos River Authority was created. And Leonard Tillotson resigned from the legislature in order to become the general manager of that district. But the Conservation Amendment was not merely created to address water management problems of the 1910s. It was created to address water management problems of Texans far into the future. As Leonard Tillotson explained, the impetus behind the Conservation Amendment was that, quote, so lavish had nature been with Texas that no obligation rested upon organized society to provide plans of economical use or development of natural resources, or to consider the graver problem of formulating policies of conservation permitting of present utilization under conditions consistent with an enlightened sense of the responsibility of society to posterity. In other words, we Texans thought we had it easy, so we didn't include adequate provisions in the Constitution to provide for future generations of Texans. Leonard Tillotson also explained that the Conservation Amendment is, quote, a constructive policy upon the part of the state for the protection of these great sources of wealth which nature so bountifully endowed our commonwealth, and the injunction that the legislature shall pass all laws appropriate thereto is an expression of the purpose of the people to provide for the intelligent conservation, development, and beneficial utilization of these resources in the interest and in the manner productive of the greatest good for the general prosperity and well-being of the people collectively. The Conservation Amendment is a tool that, when used intelligently, can improve the lives of all Texans. In 1949, the legislature authorized the creation of groundwater conservation districts under the authority of the Conservation Amendment, and in 2011, the legislature reaffirmed groundwater conservation districts' authority to regulate and manage groundwater under the Conservation Amendment. The Conservation Amendment continues to be the foundation of groundwater management in Texas, and now I'm going to turn it over to the panel to continue this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thales. I hope all of you appreciate the importance of the Conservation Amendment in terms of Texas history, and we really do appreciate Thales bringing this to our attention, that the 100th anniversary occurred this year, and that we should recognize and celebrate the passage of the Conservation Amendment and the foresight of legislators and the people of Texas who enacted the amendment in 1917. So Thales has given us a good background as to the origins of the Conservation Amendment, what some of its immediate and somewhat later effects have been, and as I think indicated by the presentation, many of you who work for conservation districts, either groundwater conservation districts or some other authorities, really sort of owe your origin and that of your institution or organization to the adoption of that Conservation Amendment in 1917. It's one of those things that is, in essence, I think, sort of a living document and very important to today's Texans and will be to future Texans. And that's one of the reasons why we've assembled this panel today to talk a little bit more in specific terms about conservation, about groundwater conservation especially, and water efficiency especially. And we have a very distinguished panel before us today. You know, oftentimes a moderator or somebody introducing a panel will say that these people need no introduction. Well, that's probably really true in the case of these four individuals. So I'm basically just going to tell you their names and their specific positions today, and you can read more detail about their background if you're not familiar with them in the conference program. We have with us today Carole Baker, who's the president and CEO of the Texas Water Foundation, which many of us are associated, and has been a very important person in terms of water conservation efficiency in Texas for a number of years. I'm sure that if you have been to a conference or any type of workshop on water conservation, you've seen Carole before. Karen Guz is sitting next to her. Karen is the Water Conservation Director for the San Antonio Water System, which has really been one of the leaders in municipal water conservation, not only in Texas, but in the country. And Karen has been with the San Antonio Water System for several years now and has really taken the program of water conservation to ever greater heights. Sitting next to Karen is Carlos Rubinstein, who has worn many hats during his long and distinguished career. Probably most of you know him best as the former chairman of the Texas Water Development Board, who was appointed at that position by Governor Perry after the reorganization of that agency in 2013. But he's been involved in water issues and also municipal government and is now a private consultant on water issues. And last and certainly not least, Andy Sansom, now Dr. Andy Sansom, who is with the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University here in San Marcos, I think Andy and I probably have known each other the longest of any of the people on the panel. I think we've probably known each other for about 40 years now, in many different situations. But Andy, especially in his role at one time with the Nature Conservancy, later Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and more recently at Texas State, has been one of the major figures in terms of water policy in the state of Texas, and certainly a lot of the progress we've made in water policy is because of Andy's guidance. So we've talked in advance and looked at some topics that we'd like to focus attention on in this discussion about the Conservation Amendment of 1917, and especially what it means today in terms of current practices in water policy and what it may mean in the future. And we sort of divided up the territory a little bit in terms of who's going to talk about various aspects of that. So I'm going to pose a few questions to our panelists, and we'll have their responses. And then toward the end of this session, as I understand it, people are able to submit questions that we will respond to as time permits. So the first question that I'm going to direct to both Andy and Carlos, whatever order you'd like to respond, is what has the 1917 Conservation Amendment meant for water management as a whole in Texas? And what progress or markers can we attribute to it? And how has that language shaped the path for water resource management? Let's start with Andy.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you for that introduction, particularly given that everyone up here knows more about water than I do, so I appreciate being included. I can't help but reflect again on the irony of being here 100 years after a flood in the very same region of the state that caused this amendment that we're discussing and celebrating to take place. And to reflect that, for better or for worse, most of the profound water policy decisions that we make as a state only come after crisis. And that's one of the things that hopefully in the future we'll be able to overcome, is to really look forward. The other thing I think that's interesting to reflect on is that the word conservation meant something different in those days than it does today. When I first got started and you and I met, conservation was largely thought of as a way of getting maximum use out of water by building infrastructure, such as reservoirs or other water infrastructure. So we talked about conservation and reclamation as a different concept than perhaps we think of it today. A couple of other things that caught my attention, and I couldn't encourage you all more to read Thales's full paper if you get a chance, because it's really insightful. Tillotson, the author, had a couple of visions for the amendment that may or may not have actually come about. One was that he believed that the doctrine of prior appropriation was actually detrimental in Texas because it took water out of sort of a common good and made it essentially a property right. The second thing that Tillotson believed was that this amendment was not simply an enabling law, it was a mandate, and that he believed that it was a directive for the legislature and succeeding Texans to actually take aggressive action to address our water problems in the state.
I'll continue on with the thought that Andy has started. I also am reminded of how we have, after either a prolonged drought or a devastating flood, have tried to respond. And in preparing for today's panel, I would look back into our history. 30, 40 years even before this amendment, we had tried to figure out how it is that we were going to conserve water by building reservoirs. In the 1880s after that drought. And we figured out that the only way we could do it, because as Theo mentioned, because of the limitation on the amount of debt that we could incur, is that we needed to have these reservoirs, but the only way we were going to be able to build them is if we used prison labor. And that didn't work out so well for us. You asked also about markers as to what has the Conservation Amendment allowed us to do and how we've benefited. It isn't just a moment in time. This, I think, was a watershed moment. Just like the drought of 2013 was a watershed moment for Texas, I think this amendment was as well. I don't think, for example, that we wouldn't have had the river authorities we have if it wasn't for the amendment. We wouldn't have the groundwater conservation districts that were created starting in the 40s and then certainly after the drought of the 50s occurred without the authority of the amendment. I don't think we would have had water master programs if we didn't have the amendment. I also tend to agree, having been fortunate enough to serve as water master for the Rio Grande, a system that doesn't operate on the prior appropriation system, that there was a lot of wisdom in that there is potentially we had an opportunity to manage water a little bit differently. And then I come to some of the issues we've dealt with lately. I don't think we would have been able to, and as I look at Tara over here, had the amendment to give us the evergreen authority to issue debt for water projects that Senator Hinojosa championed in 2011, I believe, without the authority to be able to incur the debt. I don't think we'd have money to fund the science that we need. And you look at the back of the room, all the folks that are presenting, some of them very much focused on that kind of activity. If we didn't have the ability to incur the debt to be able to advance it, I don't think we'd have the SWIFT program if it wouldn't have been for those authorities. And I do not think that we would be better positioned today to be able to withstand droughts and also, regrettably, the devastating impacts of flood had it not been for the vision and the authority that was granted, rightfully so, by the 1917 amendment. I'll only close with this. I found very interesting that you mentioned that it passed 60-40. I remember when the Evergreen Authority was voted on by the state of Texas, I think like 53-47 it passed. Fortunately, when we got to voting on SWIFT, it passed by a little bit better. I think Texans, when you challenge them to deal with water and you leave the decision to them, they always respond in the appropriate way.
Thank you. So I guess one of the shorthands of what you said, Carlos, is that many of us owe our jobs and our careers to the Conservation Amendment of 1917. A couple of other questions for both you and Andy. What has it meant specifically for groundwater conservation districts? Carlos touched on this. In what ways is it an important component of groundwater conservation districts' mission? And what ways is it challenging for districts? We obviously live in a time of change, and many changes are coming down the pike. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on how the Conservation Amendment and the challenges of groundwater districts will change in the future and what the basis of the amendment may mean. Andy?
I think probably for me the most interesting question would be what it did not do, which is to help us resolve the conflict in the state between how we manage groundwater and how we manage surface water. And at the time that the amendment passed, I guess it was probably inconceivable that that would even be an issue as the language about how lavish our resources were, et cetera. But today, in my mind, for future generations, that's probably one of the largest, if not the largest, water policy issue, and the amendment simply did not envision that we would come to this point.
Yeah, I agree with that, and then you bring it to the issues that we're discussing in water policy today, and for example, what the legislature focused this last session and what is rightfully, or either whatever side you're on it, I guess, going to be looking at in the future. There's a lot of talk about how is it that we're managing these resources, and should the decisions continue to be made at groundwater conservation district level, or should they be elevated, or the thought process elevated to the GMA? What do we do with property rights, and however you want to envision it. More importantly, in my mind as well, or equally as important, is how do we value, mitigate, and protect the basin of origin concerns? I think that the authorities that are granted in the creation of the groundwater conservation districts and the thought behind it, again, it goes back to the 1917 amendment. I think to the extent that we're going to be able to have proper valuations of water, the issues that Andy talked about are critical. Here we go.
And I think that it's important to once again reflect that Tillotson and the other leaders who caused this amendment to come into being clearly envisioned the water issues of our state to be regional in nature. And that was a central element of their thinking.
Mm-hmm. And along those lines, I think, one of the challenges we'll continue to have is not only how do we vision the regionalization, how is it that we solve Texas's problems? You've all heard me say this before. I am a firm believer that Texas cannot solve its water problems if it cannot move water from where it is to where it isn't. But that also means that we have to manage it appropriately. So you cannot indiscriminately think, oh, well, we're just going to deprive this area of the water they had and we're going to move it over here for additional growth we'll have. How is it that we're going to have the right amount of science? How is it that we're going to be able to manage those interests? I think those are challenges that will come in the future. I also think that, the continuing discussions that we have about MAGs and DFCs, all of them being able to be established because of the amendment will continue to be there, if not more pressing. And I also think that these discussions will get more heated, not when we're in periods of flood, but when we're in periods of drought. And sometimes not necessarily the right decisions come out of those discussions.
I agree with Carlos and would only add that if we think that in a state where we have up to 60 inches of rainfall in the east and as little as 12 in the west, we're not going to continue to talk about moving water westward, then we're fooling ourselves.
It's been mentioned a couple times that the original concept of conservation really was more about impounding or saving water or using infrastructure to make water available for water supply, flood control, other purposes. Over the years, though, and not too long ago, the term conservation has come to have a different meaning in terms of water for many of us. And I actually remember, as some of you here today I'm sure do, in 1985 in the Texas legislature there was a package of water legislation that was pretty extensive that was enacted. And one of the bills in that package was a water conservation bill. That did a variety of things, but one of the things it did was to add a new definition of water conservation to the Texas Water Code. Interestingly enough, it did not, because the politics did not allow it at the time, take out the old traditional concept of conservation, which was basically impoundment of water and saving it for the future, but it added a new definition of conservation that dealt with efficiency and reuse and recycling and things of that nature. And that's what many of us really work on today and promote, because regardless of anything else, from the perspective of many people, we see that as the essential foundation for water policy in Texas, that we must be as efficient as possible in our use of our existing supplies so that we're better able to manage and make wise use of those resources. And to the people who have been particularly dedicated and important in that regard, as I indicated earlier, are Karen Guz and Carole Baker. So a couple questions to Karen and Carole. First of all, this maybe goes without saying for many people in the room, but what are some of the controversial aspects of conservation efforts in Texas as we have defined conservation in this, quote, new way, unquote?
Well, the first thing about conservation is to ask who has to conserve. If I talk to most water users, they're going to naturally conclude that I'm not wasting water. My use of water is necessary. It's somebody else's use of water that maybe isn't so appropriate. Now we have the controversy. So I live in a really diverse community. I have everything from large manufacturers to homeowners to sports fields. And I guarantee you that somebody in San Antonio thinks somebody else's use in one of those categories is bad. But the folks who have kids who play Little League, they don't think it's bad to maintain a sports field. You know, shouldn't we have a safe sports field for our kids? Maybe I actually have cranky people call me and say, why are they watering those sports fields? That's terrible. You shouldn't allow If you want a job, maybe you like that we have manufacturers that use water to make products or to produce the food that we eat. And yet, I've had people call me and say, you need to shut off those big users. So that's, I think, one of the challenges that we have is how we define what reasonable water use is, how we get everybody to an efficient use, and does that mean trying to use less water to do the same thing? Because that's really what conservation has come down to today. If water conservation is going to be a future water supply, which is how we contemplate it in our state water plan, in order to accomplish that, we can't just be more efficient and then use more units of whatever we're doing and use the same amount of water, but say, hey, I'm being efficient, it's okay. We actually have to succeed in doing the same things with less. Make sense? And we have to do it at a pretty large scale in this state. If we're going to meet our future water needs, a big chunk of that, 30% or more, is going to come from doing the same things with less water. That's the message we need to get to everybody. And so when I talk to people who are upset with someone else's water use, my comment on it is, well, let's talk about, are they contributing to conservation? And in my experience, we can get every one of those users that I mentioned, whatever they are, to try to be more effective at using water in a way that means they use less for their needs. So we can overcome that controversy, but I think it's worth just remembering that maybe everybody thinks it's okay until somebody comes to them and asks them to change their habits.
Carole.
Well, let's see, over the last 30 years that we've been talking about this, there's one of my favorite themes has always been that when we talk about conservation these days, it's not the emergency measures that happen during a dire situation like we have. We were talking earlier that, it's flooding, so why do people think we need to talk about conservation? Conservation is permanent and ongoing, which is what they've done in San Antonio and a lot of our cities have done. I think, we struggle with the state actually giving us the ability to make people more aware of things. We've done a lot of research from the foundation with the Water Development Board. We know that about 28% of the people in Texas actually know where their water comes from. Why is that important? Because as you dig into that, those are the people that are actually interested in conserving water. Other people just haven't gotten into that mode yet. And yet we don't mess with Texas. We recycle. That's wonderful. We contribute money from the state to that program. And that's a program that's a great example for us as far as water goes, because we are able to see the behavior changes over the years, and most of that came from our kids in the beginning, grandkids. And so we still, Kid and I have kind of beaten our heads against a brick wall for a long time, since 2004 actually, about getting the state to fund some awareness programs. So how do we make people more aware? Some of the districts I know are doing some great work. Some of our cities are doing great work. I still think that we need an overriding program that kind of helps out a lot of other districts, which is kind of where the groundwater districts come in. Sarah and Beth and I have been plotting a little, trying to figure out, okay, what would groundwater districts be able to do to contribute to water conservation programs and awareness. And a lot of times that's like the wholesalers or the river authorities who tell me we don't have a connection to the end customer. We're not the city. We're not billing that end customer, so what can we do? Well, there's a lot that can be done. I mean, we're not just talking about people watering their yard twice a week or anything. I mean, we're talking about a full-scale program like they do in San Antonio, but with business and industry and commercial interest. And so what we have asked a lot of the wholesalers and river authorities to do is to really think about a public relations program, basically, with their districts to actually provide resources. And I'm sure y'all never have any kind of confrontation in any of your district meetings or, or anything. There's never any controversy in the paper. But, you know, the point is that maybe you don't have, you can't tell somebody how many times they can water their yard, but what you can do is provide resources. I know some of you have hired water conservation coordinators. We really applaud that. All of us that were on that are on the Water Conservation Advisory Council, Ken and Karen and I, that we really felt like that was an important link to going out and being able to do things in the public. Now, how does that benefit you other than PR? It really brings you in as a partner to work with all of us who are trying to get this message out that, yeah, it's flooding. We have way more water than we need down in Houston right now, but it's going to be gone. We are going to have another drought. So that's why we always say we would like for that to be permanent, ongoing things you already have in place, not to address a drought, not to address a flood, but just programs that give you the reputation of being people who really care about water efficiency, conservation, who are looking at a bigger picture than just the residential homeowner, because there's so many other things. There's so much new efficient technology out there for industry, so many things that can be done. We have wonderful opportunity with the board and the 20% set aside for conservation programs that is kind of mind-boggling when we think about the fact that actually got in there. And there are programs that are doing. Right now, the programs have a lot to do with leak detection, and that's certainly something you want to do if you're a utility first thing. But there's really a lot of opportunity in the regional water planning for you to get conservation programs into the plan so that they can be funded with that money. So I think we have a lot of resources a lot of you may not even know about, and so I'm hoping that y'all would work with the Texas Water Foundation. We would like to partner up with you. Carlos is the chair. Ken and Andy are both on the board too. So we have some good knowledge on there, and we're all about partnerships, but we also know a whole lot about what's out there that might be available to you. So I want to offer that to you, and Sarah may be talking about that some too. The reason that's so important to me, the reason y'all are so important, besides the fact that you're my favorite group anyway, but is that you actually represent a whole bunch of people that we don't really get to. I mean, we work with the cities and we work with the river authorities and people, but rural Texas or medium-sized cities in Texas, we don't always have an avenue into what's happening in those regions, but you do. You have a unique audience that a lot of us just don't have, and so I think it's really, I guess I'm challenging you this morning, but I think it's really important that we do look at working in partnership and trying to get that awareness out, because I really don't think I can go through another session trying to get any money from the state. So I think, we have to just take it upon ourselves to do it, and we can do that, but we really do need your help in doing that.
Karen, let me follow up with you in terms of what you see specifically that groundwater conservation districts could do to help promote conservation and efficiency as we've been discussing it.
Well, I think Carole alluded to two things that I'm going to reinforce that she really covered. One is that people being interested in conserving starts with understanding where their water is coming from. That's one of the things Carole talked about, that what we call sometimes water IQ, how high is your water IQ? Well, everybody in this room has a really high water IQ. But if you talk to citizens in your communities, it would be surprising if a lot of people can name outright what the source of their water is. How many of you think they could name your aquifer, your groundwater source by name? A lot of people in your community? I don't know. But it's important if people have a sense of where their water's coming from and how that source is doing. So that education that you may already be trying to do is a critical component of conservation. I think a secondary thing is getting people's awareness up of opportunities, maybe through partnerships. If you don't have a program that you have the staff to run, partnerships in your community with other organizations that do can be helpful. We are partnering with a groundwater district, the Trinity Glenrose, on some programs where we overlap in my area. They're partnering with Master Gardener Group to get the awareness up in areas where they are. They're partnering with homeowner associations, places where people gather so that they can get people more educated on what it is that they're trying to do. Any of those things really help a lot because once people have a better awareness, then they are receptive. The best water conservation incentive program or education program in the world is really going to fall flat if people don't see the point of it.
Thank you. I think we have a little time for some questions from the audience. Do you have some, Sarah? Okay. All right, this is a very interesting question. I'm going to pose it to Carlos first.
Okay.
Does the rule of capture conflict with the Conservation Amendment?
What was the next question? In my comments, I alluded to the fact that more and more, and in particular, I think you saw it during this last session, more and more you're having more discussions about how are we going to be able to develop markets for water, how we're going to be able to move water from where it is to where it isn't, how is it that we're going to be able to protect the source, which is what you do with groundwater conservation districts, obviously. How we're going to properly permit the use, how we're going to make sure that the resource is available into the future at a desired point, coupled with, if I own the land and I own the water, who are you to tell me that I cannot market it myself? And I think that those conflicts will have existed. I think Andy made a reference in his comments as well, that while the amendment and other subsequent statutes have addressed concerns, they haven't fully resolved the underlying question. And so, yeah, those conflicts exist, and they regrettably will continue to exist. Just as much, let me add to the question as well, as the conflict that folks don't want to deal with or don't want to recognize as an opportunity as well, we're going to have increased water use, but we also need to protect and respect the uses of water for our ecosystems and our environment. And when you leave out any one of those, then you're not properly valuing the water in Texas.
Okay. Andy, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think it's important to point out that the amendment laid the groundwork for management in the context of the rule of capture. It was interesting to note that under that sort of enabling view, we didn't have any groundwater management districts in the state until many years after the amendment passed. And it was only because of a conflict between business and municipal interests in the Panhandle that were frightened that the Ogallala was going to be completely exhausted, and the agricultural guys who were threatened by the fact that we did, and I see CE back there, have the first groundwater management district created. And so I would say that it only by virtue of the fact that we had the amendment have we been able to manage in the context of the rule of capture.
Okay. Are there any questions from the audience? You may feel free to. I think we have a couple microphones available. Anyone? Okay, I have one final question for the panelists then, real quick. If the constitutional amendment were before Texas voters today, would it pass?
Go ahead.
Well, I would say the sooner we get it before the voters after what's happening on the coast, the chances of it passing are very good.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. And it goes back to, if you think about it, every time that we've taken water management issues to the voters, the decision has been the right decision.
In my community, I'm going to say this wrong probably, I think it's 4 times that the citizens of San Antonio have voted to tax themselves to protect land over our recharge zone. And so that's pretty remarkable to have that happen over and over again when it has to be re-upped. So I tend to agree that if you get information before the citizens of Texas, they make the right choice for water. And consistently, when we survey citizens and ask them what are the pressing issues that we have to take care of, water tends to come up to the top. Now, it helps if there was just some horrible event like a flood or we're in the middle of a drought. But people, I think our citizens remember that next drought is right around the corner and the next flood is one big storm away, and that they will make the right choices.
Well, I agree with all of that, but I think, too, the way we make sure that happens is that we do get people educated, not just during the flood and just during the drought, but that people understand the big picture, the challenges and the future, and just how water impacts energy industry, population growth, tourism, make them connect that issue more to the big picture than just wondering how often to water their yard. So I think we probably would pass it, but I think only with that kind of background.
Right, thank you all. All right, well, I think we've reached the end of our appointed time. I want to thank, first of all, Thales for really initiating this discussion. I think it's also very rewarding for a person who has been in academia as a teacher to see young people step forward and take leadership and initiative in trying to promote management and conservation of water. So I appreciate Thales' role in this. And I want to thank all of my friends here on the panel for adding to the discussion, reflecting upon the meaning of the Conservation Amendment and where we may go in the future. And I very much appreciate the fact that we're ending this session on an optimistic note that the Conservation Amendment would pass again today because we still have all those water challenges ahead of us. And while we've made a lot of progress, it's a long way down the road. Thank you all.